Hello, in this video I'm going to show you how to use the InterText editor. This is a translation alignment application. It allows you to align two documents, a source with its translation, and then on the basis of that alignment you can then export a translation memory in the form of a TMX file. So this is an open source application. It can be run on Windows, Linux, or Mac OS, and there are links in the video notes that will explain where you can download InterText, as well as a link to this online comprehensive guide, which goes over everything in a lot more detail, but I'm going to show you the basics and everything you need to know here. So let's get started. So in this video, we're going to use it's specifically geared towards 84000's TM project. However, this method can be adapted, it's intended to be adapted by anyone for any language pairing, whether it's Tibetan to English or other. So when you download and install InterText and open it up, the user interface will look something like this. And the first thing we need to do is create a repository. Basically, InterText doesn't edit text files directly. It imports them to a repository. We create the alignment there, and then you can export TMX files from that. So to create a repository, go to Alignment, Repository Manager, and click New. We'll just call this one Tutorial. And then for the version names, this is going to be the source followed by the translation, and we're going to put the language code. So for Tibetan, you'll type this in, that's BO, and for the translation, English is EN, and hit OK. Then it's going to immediately ask us for those two files. And so for the 84000 project, we've actually created a script to kind of pre-segment the text and set up all of the tags. And you don't have to worry about that. I'm going to hand off the text file to you, but just so you can kind of see, the script will go through and create line breaks in all the places where we anticipate a segment break is going to be. And so it's just a simple text file, and it looks like that. And there's more documentation in the on the GitHub for how we set up that script. So back to InterText. Let me close that. It first asks us for the translation file. I mean the source file, sorry. So it'll be tagged -bo like this. And then it's going to ask you how you would like to pre-segment the text. So as I showed you, we've already done that with all the line breaks. So for paragraphs, we're going to select separated by line breaks. And for sentences, also select separated by line breaks. Really, there aren't any paragraphs, but that's just the default. You'll hit OK, and then it's going to immediately ask us for the English translation file. So that'll be tagged -en. And then for the English, we're going to do it slightly differently. The English, we've also set up paragraph breaks on the actual paragraphs and also the ends of stanzas. So for paragraphs, also select line break. And then don't worry about this create elements line, you can just leave that as is. But then for sentences, you're going to click automatically segment text using profile default. So this will use InterText's inbuilt alignment tool. It's called Hung Align, and it's going to basically look take a look at the English and find periods and semicolons and kind of organize the segmentation according to that. So we'll hit OK. This dialog will come up letting us know that it's using the Hung align, and we'll just click OK. And we'll just take a moment, and then it should look something like this. So basically it's gone through and it's used our original Tibetan segmentation, and then for English it kind of spread everything out, broke up sentences, and it kind of tries to line up segments according to character length. So, it found a big chunk of text here, it tries to line that up with a chunk of text here, and kind of lines it up beginning to end according to the amount of characters. So it kind of gets us close, and then we go in and refine from there. So before we begin editing, I just want to point out two important setup steps you should take. The first one is the Tibetan will probably not display properly initially. And that's just, you'll need to select a font that will display. So you'll go to Options and Settings, and then go to View, and then here's the font. So you can use any Tibetan font you like, but I like Jomalari because I know with Jomalari the default Roman fonts will all be Times New Roman, and it will properly display the Sanskrit diacritics. So that's why I like Jomalari, but you can use whatever Tibetan font you like. And then you'll hit OK. And then the other thing to set up is to go, very important, go to Options, Settings, and under the General tab, make sure this Advanced Enable Cross-Order Alignment is checked. And I'll explain that in a moment here. And then hit OK, and then now we're ready to edit. And so the editing commands in InterText are very simple. You can either move things around with the mouse or use the hotkeys. I recommend primarily just using the hotkeys, and I'll explain why in a moment here. But first I'll just point out the basic layout. It kind of looks like a spreadsheet, right? There's a column for Tibetan, a column for English, and then there's these rows. In the final TMX file, each row is going to be a segment. So the rows are defining the actual translation memories. But notice within each cell, there's also these double arrows or single arrow. This is what InterText is defining a double arrow as a paragraph and a single arrow, or the beginning of a paragraph, and a single arrow as a sentence within that paragraph. For our setup, that distinction isn't very important. What's more important for us is defining the final segment, which will be these rows. But just know that these units you can move around within the rows, and you can put multiple units in a single cell. And you can also split larger segments or larger units into smaller ones by going right-click split, and then you kind of break things into smaller pieces and then move those pieces around. So if you hover over the center of any row, you'll notice these up and down arrows. These are the basic commands. So a single green arrow pops up one translation unit into the row above. So if we want to move Tamje Kempala Chaksalo up into row 1, we would click here, and then it moves it up into row 1, and then we can move it back like so. And then if we want to move this entire cell down one position, say we want to move all of this down into 3, we'll click the double arrow, and it moved everything in this cell down to here, and then also adjusted everything below it. So adjusted everything down 1. and likewise for going back. So in this way, like these 3 units, I wanted to move down here, but then I just want to pop the first one back. So I get Tamje Kempala Chaksalo all by itself. And then these 4 green arrows all affect the Tibetan column, and these 4 all affect the English column. And then the blue arrows move the entire row, both the Tibetan and the English, up and down one. So it will move see, it created everything in 2 and moved it to 3, or we can move everything back. And that also will adjust everything below it. So this we might use, sometimes you'll get large spaces and we'll want to move everything up and down. Okay, so one reason why I don't recommend using the mouse like this is you may have noticed if you adjust something, it begins to scroll down through the entire text, adjusting everything, and it's really distracting when you're trying to edit. So one way to avoid that is if you immediately click afterwards, that stops the scrolling. But better yet, if you just use the hotkeys and basically go to Edit, and it will show you all of the hotkeys for these commands we just went over, all the up and down arrows. So basically, we're just going to use the arrow keys on the keypad, and we're going to use Control up and down to pop up single units, backspace and return to move entire cells up and down, or the Control backspace or Control return to move the entire row. And using this method, you'll find is much more convenient. It works quite smoothly. You can just move things around very conveniently. Sometimes things will kind of bunch up. You'll get a bunch of segments all together, and then you can just hit return a couple times to move them back down and then pop them back up. And you'll quickly kind of get the hang of it, and you'll find it's quite convenient. The one place where we do need to use the mouse is when we want to split a unit into smaller pieces. So for like Tamje Kempala Chaksalo, I want to just have homage to the omniscient one. So I'll click right here in the English where I want to split, and I'll right-click split, and that'll create 2 units, and then I can separate them. And sometimes if you have like a really big segment and you want to split it a lot into lots of pieces, you can just keep it in that editor mode and just split it multiple times like that, and then it'll break those all into pieces, and then you can go back and move those around. So that's handy. You'll notice these little tags, and I'll explain those in a minute. But those are the basic commands, and that's how you move the units around. So one thing I wanted to point out, when you go into a segment to split something, you'll notice the cursor appears, and it looks like this, and it's actually in editor mode now. And when you every time you click out of editor mode, it doesn't ask it for me, but you'll see a dialog box that asks you if you want to save the changes to the file in the repository, and you'll just hit OK because it's tracking those changes. But it gets a little annoying if it appears every time you want to split the segment, or split a translation unit. So there'll be a little box at the bottom of the dialog that says check this if you don't want to receive this message again, and then it won't ask you that each time, and you can work more smoothly. So the next thing I want to show you is a feature that allows you to flip the order of segments in the English. We're going to keep the Tibetan in the same order, but as you know in Tibetan, because the grammar differs so much from English, oftentimes the order is going to flip. For instance, in this segment in 26 here, Kelpachewa Trakya Trangmetu, this actually corresponds to the English even though they are bound to circle in samsara's oceans. And then the next segment, Soa Marungpani Trakmingyor, this corresponds to those of unwholesome livelihood. So the English flipped it, and we're going to use this feature called, and this is what we set up in the beginning with the settings, the enable cross-order alignment feature. So to do that, you just first separate the segments the way you want them. So I'm just going to isolate what we want to put in the segments. And now this, the English in 27 matches with the Tibetan in 26, and the English in 26 matches with 27 in the Tibetan. Then we just go to 27 in the English and go to edit, swap with the preceding segment, or you can just do Control X, and it'll flip it with the one just above it. And now they're lined up. It doesn't actually change the text file, it just tells the alignment that those two segments are flipped, and you can just set it up that way. It works well. So like any text editor, you'll have basic features that you'd expect. You can do Control Z to undo. If you want to find something, do Control F, and you just have to tell it if you want to search the left column, right, or both. And the next thing I want to show you is this is particular to 84,000's methodology. Because we want these TMs to be used for future Tibetan translation projects, we want to segment everything according to the grammar of the Tibetan and not, or take as little cues from the English as possible. So this creates a bit of a challenge when the English has compounded two or more Tibetan segments into a single segment. For example, 143 and 144 here we have Tukyangshe and Tsukyangshe, and the English put these together as he knows the phases and the degrees. So for TM editors, here's what we're going to do. I don't want you to ever change the English translation. If you think there's an error, you can always flag the errors, flag a possible error, and I'll show you how to do that in a moment here. But when you have to separate a compounded English segment, what we're going to do is copy the whole thing, just Control C, and then we're going to create a new unit, which is just insert element, or hit the I key is the hotkey for that. And then we'll duplicate that segment and paste it exactly the same. And then we're going to add square brackets to anything that doesn't correspond with the matching Tibetan. So tsut here refers to the degrees. So we're going to bracket the phases here. And then in the one above, we're going to just bracket do is the phases. So we'll bracket the degrees here. And hopefully we won't have to do this too often because it takes a little time, but I think it's a very eloquent way of separating out segments like this. Arguably, these two could be put together since they're kind of closely related, part of the same thought. But because it continues here in the Tibetan, we have 3 independent segments, each with their own subject and verb. To be consistent, it'd be good if these were all their own separate segments. So that's how we're going to approach that situation. And there's more details in the TM guidelines. So that's pretty much it for the editing commands. There are a few other features that I haven't gone over, but everything is given in more detail in the InterText guidelines, and it's all pretty self-explanatory if you look through the menu bar. So now I'd just like to point out some of the tags we're using in our own text files for this 84,000 project. First, you'll notice these dollar signs with a 1 and 2 and so forth. These correspond to the milestones in the actual 84,000 publication. If you open the reading room, you'll see that they correspond to the milestones. So you can just pretty much ignore those. They're more kind of placeholders so that when we export the TM, we can add it back in as metadata. But they'll usually appear at the beginning of a paragraph, so just make sure they are at the beginning of any segment, and not, for instance, if it becomes between 2 segments, make sure it's like in row 3 here, make sure it's the beginning of the segment rather at the end of row 2. But you don't have to pay any attention to those necessarily. You'll see the bracketed folio numbers, like right here, 143b. Sometimes those won't line up exactly with the Tibetan. That's okay, don't worry about it. The other one tag you should pay more attention to are these hashtags. So let me find one. Here's one. So when you see a hashtag like this number 2 here, that corresponds to an endnote in the actual publication. The content of the endnote isn't displayed here, but if you go to, for instance, for this number 2, you can go to the 84,000 reading room and go to the notes section of that text, and then 2 will tell you what that note says. So it says Tibetan read here Shing Amara Sung We Tsel. And so there's an issue discussed in detail at the beginning in the introduction. Basically, you should check endnotes in case if you suspect that there is an alternate source used. Usually, these texts are mostly translated from the Dege Kangir, but if it's a different Kangir edition, or occasionally it's a translation is used from a Sanskrit or Chinese source, then it's obviously not going to match the Tibetan in the file we're using here, because this is all from the Dege. So if there is ever an endnote that is from an alternate source, then we want to flag that. I know these aren't aligned here, but I'll just give you an example. And we're just going to flag it with a simple exclamation point like this. And then the lead editor will go in and check that segment and add the proper metadata so that it's flagged, and then when this TM is recalled in the future, the translator will know that it's might not exactly match up to the Dege. Sometimes it'll be quite close. It'll just be such a minor difference that we may want to keep the TM even though it's coming from a different source. but other times it might be totally different. So we're going to use some different flags, and those will be refined when the TM is finalized. But for now, you can just put in an exclamation point as a flag just in the Tibetan column every time there is an alternate source used. And the endnotes will tip you off to whether a alternate source is being used. The next flag we're going to use is a flag for possible errors. And so for this, if there's just a plain typo in the English, or if you suspect that it was translated incorrectly, and you look in the reading room and there's no annotation giving an explanation for why it was translated differently, then I want you to flag the English with an percentage character like this, in the same way at the very beginning of the English segment like this. And this will also be reviewed by the lead editor later on. Even if it's even if it's a typo that you could easily just correct, I don't want you to correct it, because we're likely not only want to correct the TM file, but we want to go and correct the typo in the publication as well. So these publications have gone through a long editorial process, so hopefully you won't encounter errors very often, but they occasionally do pop up. And so if you do suspect an error, go ahead and just put in this flag. You'll also enter it into an error sheet, and there's instructions for that in the TM guidelines in more detail. And then finally, so yeah, those are the tags we're using. I think I went through them all. Yes. And so the last thing I'm going to show you is when you've completed the alignment and you're ready to export the text, you just go to Alignment, Export Text As, and TMX file. And you'll hit OK. Just save it to your desktop or whatever, and then you'll email it to me, and then I'll finalize. I'll check it over and finalize it, and we will, and then it'll be done. So yeah, that's pretty much it. One last thing I wanted to show you. You may be wondering where I mentioned it's not editing the text directly. It's importing it to a repository. You might be wondering where the repository is. I'm someone who I just like to know where files are kept on my computer. So if you go to the InterText guidelines, which are posted in the links, and go to the beginning of chapter 4, and then the first footnote in chapter 4 will tell you, depending on Linux, Mac, and Windows, where the repository is kept. And you might have to hunt around a little bit. Mine was in a hidden file in the app data local InterText. But these are super light. Since we're just using text files, as you can see, they're super lightweight files. So that's where it's kept on your computer if you're curious. And you can also, if you're done with a repository from the repository manager, you can also delete them here, and it'll delete it from that repository folder. So that's it. If you have any questions, feel free to comment in the video comment section, and best of luck, and thank you. One last addendum to this tutorial. I just want to point out a couple tips for working efficiently in InterText. One thing is occasionally the script, especially for the Tibetan, may give you really long segments. and you'll need to break them up into smaller pieces. So one thing I noticed when you click to go into editor mode, you can split multiple, make multiple splits at once. The first split will take you out of editor mode, but if you go right back into editor mode a second time, then on the second time you can do a series of splits all at once. And you can actually just read through quickly and then go back through them and make additional splits if you're needed. But if you if you just need to break it down into smaller chunks, you can do that really quick and click out, and then it'll be kind of more manageable. The other point I'd like to point out is to become familiar with these, the difference between the double green arrow and the single green arrow, or the commands that they correspond to. The single arrow just pops up a single unit, and the double arrow moves the whole cell. So, for instance, occasionally they get all the units will get bunched up into one cell like this. Your first thought might be to move each one down one by one, but the problem with that is you'll have to do that for each cell as you go down. So what I've found works really well in this scenario when they get all bunched up in a single cell, use the double arrow command to move the whole cell down one, and then just pop up the units that you want to use for that segment, and then continue in that manner, and you'll see that they'll gradually thin out. So that's just a couple tips you can kind of try out and use these different commands, kind of become familiar with them. And I think it'll take a little getting used to, but once you learn how they work, you'll see that it's really efficient. Okay, thank you.